Welcome to Charlestown beyond the neck. Then it was known as Walford, and now is known as Somerville. I am portraying a descendant of the first settler of Charlestown, Mr. Walford. Now, I'm Lawrence Walford. I'm a principal in the tavern down at Sandy Pit. And accompanying me this evening is Lois, one of my associates at the tavern. I hope you'll come down to Sandy Pit for a beverage now and then, or some other thing you want to partake. For those who don't know what Sandy Pit was the landing down Milk Row, where all the agricultural product went down Milk Row, which you might know as Somerville Avenue, and then goes into a landing where it went for the Charles River, and all the produce, milk, beverage, food, grain and so forth, went up the Millis River. Well, it might have been known then as Liberty Pole Square in the 1850s, and finally in 1861 it was known as Union Square because it was a Union recruiting station. But just to let you know where you are and why we're here, I've been asked to speak a little bit about Somerville, its history and its heritage. And I hope that you bear with me. I'll try to give you information. Now, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. I may answer them immediately, or I may just put it off for a minute, but I will not ignore what you have to say. This land was basically settled by the Algonquin tribe. An interesting bit about our history is that about the time that Christopher Columbus discovered the New World, there were as many Native Americans in the Americas as there was in Europe, about 250 million individuals. Unfortunately, because of their inability to resistance to disease, they had catastrophic examples. In 1620, 1630, there were 3,000 Native Americans in this area. 50 years later, only 20% of that total remained. So the Native American presence was very predominant, but unfortunately with the advent of man, Europeans and so forth, they did not survive. This was a preferred area. They had herring, and this was a preferred site. I believe they had a summer site up on the Mystic Lakes. So when John Winthrop came in 1630, he decided that he liked this area so much that he managed to get 600 acres of it, especially in 10 Hills. And what is significant, which I will refer to later, is that they put a landing at 10 Hills, and in fact, the first vessel that they built in Mass Bay Colony, the Blessing of the Bay, was launched on the 4th of July, 1631. Now, there is this historical tie between the landing at 10 Hills and the Powder House and this area. But this area then became developed, and a gentleman by the name of Jean Melee purchased this area, about 10 acres, and there was a quarry behind here. You can see the stone that is in the structure. We can go in. I'm going to have Lois give you a little description about the building. But they bought the quarry and basically turned this into a farm and a mill. The Grimes millstone, that example of the millstone, is right on the ground about 50 feet due north of my location. You can basically take a shot of that if you can, so that people that come here later can look for that. There are clues of different things referred to in its history. But at that point, the Malo family, which I'm now going to turn over to Lois to talk about what this originally was used for in the early 1700s. Go to it, Lois.
Thank you, Larry. Jean Mallet was a French Huguenot refugee who came here with a group of families. Huguenots were Protestants. France was mainly Catholic then. And other famous families that were part of this group were Paul Revere's father. Revere was originally Revoir, the Fanon family, and a few others I can't think of right now. Anyway, they originally settled in Oxford, Massachusetts, and then when the French and Indian Wars started, or there were skirmishes.
King Philip's War,
King Philip's War,
1674, 1675.
Intern. They moved back here to be safer and not have their houses burned down all the time. And he decided to build a windmill. So, and he was originally a shipwright. so he was used to building sails and wooden gears and things. So this top was originally, it had a windmill top, and the whole top rotated.
This is basically a depiction of the interior of the mill.
So this was built in the French manner. It originally has 3 levels that we can see when we go inside. At this time, most windmills were wood, so it's unusual that it was built out of stone, and it was built out of the stone from this quarry.
They have a flyer more than available. You can get it at the City Hall, and a lot of the information we're describing is here. I would appreciate, by the way, if you have something to say. I mean, this is for the benefit of other people that can't be here today. This is why we're doing this. So as we go on, Lois will now describe the windmill.
This is not this windmill, but it's the type of windmill that it is. Okay, so we're going to go inside. This roof was put on when it became a powder house. There was a circular track with wooden gears and wind vanes outside to make, and all the grinding things were in here, and it would come down and be sorted. The walls are 2 feet thick. There's originally 3 floors, and you can see kind of where the floors were.
In 1747,
Yep.
Mr.
Maillet.
Malay descendants sold this property because the mill was no longer profitable to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, this is basically Middlesex County, decided that it was a suitable central location to store gunpowder for all the different cities and towns. Now, gunpowder is made from saltpeter, charcoal, and
Sulfur.
sulfur. And one of the things that has to be done is it has to be turned, or otherwise it becomes unusable. So they had to hire somebody to basically turn the gunpowder. It was controlled by a key of the local constable. Now, here we are, 1747. From approximately 1745 to about 1763, the war between France and England heated up with basically Great Britain. Great Britain and France have been fighting since early 1700 over India and over parts of the New World. It culminated in the French and Indian War from 1755 to 1763. One of the things, the British basically bankrupt themselves in that war. They did not have a large army. They had a large navy, but there was only 45,000 men in the British Army by 1760s. They basically felt, we have bankrupted ourselves defending the colonists. We think it's reasonable that they help pay, because they had 20% of the British Army was in the New World defending it. Now, true, they gained Canada, and they had some of those soldiers up there. So they felt that they needed to raise some funds to help pay for the war. At the same time, at the treaty, I don't remember what treaty it was, the Treaty of Paris, I'm not sure, in 1763, one of the concessions given was that the Indians were given concessions. Basically, they were allied with the British, and they decided to give the Indians, now this is 1763, that no expansion would go beyond the Allegheny Mountains. So all the people that had developers like George Washington, all of a sudden, I don't have that option. And there were other concessions given to the French citizens that weren't given to the British citizens. Now remember, everybody here was a British citizen. The only thing different was that every adult male between the age of 16 and 60 had to maintain a military equipment and arms. That was not true in Great Britain. Their arms were usually kept under lock and key. So also you have all these citizens that have fought in the French and Indian War and are relatively proficient. The end result is that all of a sudden you have taxation, and somebody has to say, taxation without representation is tyranny. We have a succession of acts, the Stamp Acts of 1765, the Townshend Tax, which was then repealed the next year. The Townshend Tax was then repealed. But the British always maintained a insistence that they had the right to tax.
They also said that you had to put up military people in your home, the Quartering Act.
No, that came out in
Came later?
1763.
Oh, okay.
1773. I will get to that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So things stabilized. Unfortunately, but things got to a point in 1768 where there were riots and unrest in Boston. The British were not going to hear none of this and put Boston was a town of 16,000 people, and 4,000 British soldiers show up on your door and to quell this rebellion. This did not go over well. Where are you going to put 4,000 soldiers in a town of 16,000? On the Boston Common, in Castle William. So things were not going well. They left 2 regiments in Boston. 2 of them, now you got to remember that a person to be a soldier in the British Army took them about 18 months to train. They were not the cream of society. They were not necessarily the most educated nor the most disciplined people. They also didn't make a lot of money, so they were taking jobs that basically laborers and stuff in Boston would take. This did not go over well. By the 5th of March, 1770, a bunch of drunken, unhappy workers decided to throw snowballs, rocks, and whatever against 8 British soldiers guarding the old State House. One thing led to another, and we have 5 Americans dead. The so-called Boston Massacre. The British did not order the fire. They think it was somebody threw something in the gun, discharged, and at which point one led to another. Actually, John Adams defended the British commander, and the British soldiers were. He was acquitted because he did not command the soldiers to do that. Now we have the first. Then in 1772, the British armed revenue cutter, the Gaspee, runs aground chasing smugglers because we're not going to pay this tax. We're going to smuggle things. One of the biggest smugglers was John Hancock. He was a staunch loyalist, and he's making a lot of money. And John Hancock, they impound his ship because he's taking wine that's not paying a tax on it. This doesn't go over well. You turn John Hancock from a staunch loyalist into something else. And all it took is just Sam Adams to change that perspective. The Gaspee runs aground, it is burned, and now you have attacked a British man of war. 1772. Things started to stabilize because the British only maintained attacks on tea. Then, and let me give you a little tidbit about the British tea. Now, why is tea such a big deal, and why did it cause such unrest? Well, what happened was the British East India Company had a monopoly on tea, and they ran into some difficulty in the early 1700s. Most of the members of Parliament had financial interest in the British East India Company. Now, the British East India Company ships never went to the New World. But what they did is they said, you no longer have to pay a tax in England. You can collect the tax in the New World, and we're going to discount it. So all of a sudden, with the action of the Tea Act, to help the British East India Company and probably most of the members of Parliament, they're now going to undercut all the local merchants on tea and still get their tax. Now you've got the merchants against you. So all of a sudden we talk about embargo of British goods, unrest, and then on the 16th of December, 1772, 342 chests of tea, which had to be either unloaded or sent back to England, were mysteriously dumped in the harbor by these so-called Native Americans. Now, these were by gentlemen we call the Sons of Liberty. The organization I am affiliated with was staunchly involved with that. The Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, which is based at Faneuil Hall, had many members, basically a loyalist organization, but boy, did they like to stick up the fuss. So that and the Committee of Correspondence but this wasn't the only community that had this problem. New York, Charleston, Philadelphia we're all experiencing the same type of insensitivity. Hey, what are we paying for this for? What are we getting? We don't have representation. So, meanwhile, when they passed the acts in 1774, they passed a certain amount of acts in Quebec, giving Quebec all sorts of rights we were basically demanding. Well, obviously, the tea in the harbor did not go over well. Parliament passed what we call the coercive or intolerable acts on the 24th of March, 1774. Basically saying, we're going to close the Port of Boston. We're going to close the legislature. You're not going to be able to be represented. If you want to be tried for a crime, you're going to England. We have the right to put soldiers in your home. Now, that doesn't go over too well. And the end result is Thomas Hutchinson, the loyal governor, decided to be, I've had enough. They sacked his house. I mean, he was not a bad guy. So basically they said, now General George Gage was the military commander in the colonies. He had been here for 10 years. He actually fought with General Washington in the French and Indian War in the same battle. They were both what we call soldier in arms. I mean, they were companion in arms. And he was home on leave, made the mistake of being home and being called by the king, we need you to basically become the military governor of Massachusetts as well as the commander of the land forces. So not only do they send him back to Boston to replace the governor, they send the British admiral and the British fleet to Boston also. He arrives in May 1774, and now things are not going well for the British. People are upset. The British said, we got to get a hold of the arms. We've got to get the sources of powder, cannons, and so forth. Now, this is the community storehouse. Some of the king's powder and powder for all the towns is kept here. So it was told to the British, the colonial militia, the communities are to take their powder out of the powder house. This is in the summer of 1774. We are going to take our powder back. So this is going on. On the late August 1774, William Brattle, the commander of the militia, told what's his name? Sorry about that. I think it's Thomas Phipps. He was the constable, unfortunate fellow. And David Phipps was the constable. General Gage told Major Brattle, to give the key to the powder house to the constable because we're going to take our powder. At 4 o'clock in the morning, on the 1st of September, 1774, Lieutenant Colonel George Madison and 260 soldiers from the 4th Regiment rode up the Mystic River. I can now show you a depiction of what Boston would have been like in 1774. They rode from Long Wharf around the neck of Boston and then went up the Mystic River and landed at Ten Hill Landing. They then marched up what we call Broadway to here. Sheriff Phipps gave the key to the commander, who then took half kegs of powder. Now, I don't know whether they had wagons or whatever. You actually can see the top of Winter Hill from here. If you look over through the trees, you can see the top of some of the buildings. You can actually see. It's about a half a mile, maybe 3/4 of a mile. As you can see, this is a half keg of powder. Now, remember, this thing is full with 250 of these things. You got 260 soldiers. So the question is each soldier taking one back? Remember, these guys are wearing 30, 40 pounds of gear, so there must have been some plan to take the powder back, because they sent a detachment to Cambridge to take 2 cannons off Cambridge Common and went over across the Charles River that way. The British, now Mr. David, what's his name? Mr. Phipps, he, unfortunate fellow, because when people learned that he gave the key away, they basically almost ran him, he he had to leave. He lived in Cambridge and basically had to leave. He's persona non grata, and basically he, unfortunate guy, he was a victim of circumstances, I'm sorry to say. So now the British have their powder. They go back up the Mystic River, and all of a sudden, chaos and pandemonium prevails. People don't know what's going on. Boston's been burned. The British have people been killed. I have led to believe up to 4,000 militia people ended up in Cambridge Common by the end of a week. And nobody knew anything. Nobody's in charge. We obviously don't have a very good alert system, and we certainly don't have a very good response system. Now you got to remember that one of the deals of the coercive acts was that the seat of government was moved to Salem. So the legislature was basically up in Salem. Gage comes back to Boston, and they decide that they're going to meet regardless of what the governor calls it. They pass a thing called the Suffolk Resolve about statements of what our rights are. Paul Revere, matter of fact, rides all the way. First Continental Congress, by the way, is meeting at this time, from September, 5 September to 29 October, 1774. So they get the Suffolk Resolve and they adopt it. They're saying, this is a good idea. The members of the Massachusetts so-called legislature decided to meet about 3 weeks later and decided that we needed a better system of response and we needed a better system of alert. So they designated 1/3 of all the militia companies to be ready at a minute's notice. Hence, the concept of the Minuteman was created. They set up a system of 45 riders who would then spread the alarm if the British went someplace. Because remember, the British realized they got a fort up in Portsmouth. They had, there was arms up in Salem, in Worcester. And in the middle of this, somebody stole 4 cannon from the British under their nose and smuggled them out of town. General Gage wanted those cannons back, and in fact, one of the real reasons he went out to Lexington and Concord was to get those cannons back. And 2 of them are in the State House, the Hancock and the Adams, I believe. There were 4, I think they're 3-pound cannons. The end result and significance of this building is that the powder alarm made us realize that we were not ready to respond and didn't have a mean to. We now have a system of militia response. We now have a means of being able to notify people. 6 months later, in April 1775, it works very well and led to the American Revolution. So that is the significance of this building. It then, after the British left Boston in the 17th of March, 1776, this became the powder store. In fact, actually the British were the siege, actually on the 20th of April, 1775, this became the store for powder for the Continental Army up to the time that George Washington left. The building then became in disuse and finally was sold to the Tufts, Mr. Charles Tufts,
Right.
in 1818, which now Lois is going to talk about what happened next.
In 1818, a new powder house was constructed in Cambridge on what's now called Magazine Street. And for years I thought, why is that called Magazine Street? What an odd name. But it was a powder magazine, but it's not there anymore. I don't know, I'm thinking it's at the end of it someplace. So we have Peter Tufts, who is really a farmer, who had a farm here, and I can give people a list of, this is in process. This is going to be a scavenger hunt of all the historic markers. I only have 4 of them. That signify the whole history, but there's a lamb down over the wall there that's sitting on the lawn, a metal lamb to signify when it was farmland. He and his sons became grain merchants, brick manufacturers, developers, and in 1842 this became Somerville. It broke off from Charlestown.
No, it became Walford first, and then they didn't like the name, and then changed it to Somerville.
So 1842 we have Somerville, and nobody really knows. There is a Somerville, England, but I don't know why.
It's in
Nobody
northern
knows.
England.
Yeah.
But
Anyway, from 1842 to 1872, this area underwent some of the development that all of Somerville did, starting with Union Square, which became the industrial center. But around here, there were often farm products. There was a pickle factory, George Emerson's Pickles, and down there someplace there's a facsimile of some pickle jars. And this was a great place to store pickles because it had 2-foot wide stone walls. Pickles
Right,
and
it was
horseradish.
cool and-
Horseradish products.
Right.
Sure, some of my favorites. Anyway, so in 1892, this became a public park when Nathan Tufts, one of the many Tufts descendants, gave the land to the city to be a public park. And I don't really know the exact markways, but there were carriageways in here that now are walkways. But people could drive their carriage and their horse through here in the evening, just like we're here now. Also at that time, there was some structural changes here. When it became the powder house, obviously the windmills came off and they put a roof on it. So they changed I think the door was originally on the other side and there was a window here, and I don't really know the justification for changing it. Oh, it definitely had a fireplace. What do we got here? The field house, you can see the top of the field house there, that pointy, which is built in this style, but it was built in 1930s. It was a WPA FDR project to give people out of work some good project to build. And it has been lots of different things. It was the draft board at one time. It was the licensing, auto decal, whatever you call it, the Motor Vehicles Bureau for Somerville. And people complained that there's no place to park when you come get your parking thing. It was a theater. Our theater group used it. And there was a fire there at one time.
There was a fire here, actually.
There was a fire here then. Then they were storing their stuff in
They had
here.
some fire because they stored
Okay.
it. But basically...
It's still rentable. You could rent
Yeah.
it for
So
an
what
occasion.
has happened is this is your park. The city has decided with the fact of historic preservation funds in the old powder house that they would make Milk Rose Cemetery, this powder house, and the Prospect Hill available to the public. This site is open the first Thursday of the month and the fourth Saturday of the month from 6 to 8 on Thursday and 10 to 2 noon on the Saturday.
And actually, we're featured on, I don't exactly know the year, do you? When the seal changed from the old seal to the new seal. This is in the
Sometime it was
1970s?
sometime between 1970s, my memory serves, because I remember going to that building to register for the draft a long time ago. I'm a long-time resident of the city. But this is your town, this is your park, and there's a very strong effort by the community to make it available to you and let you understand some of the little tidbits of history. One thing I wanted to just bring up before I forget was that I remember growing up and people bragging about how Somerville treated the Indians right and paid for the land. Well, wait a minute. If John Winthrop comes in here and takes 600 acres in 1630, but they don't pay Squaw Sachem until 1639, what is that called? And by the way, do you know what they paid for it? Now, you've heard about Peter Minuet and his $24 worth of jewelry from Manhattan. Well, the land grab didn't just go to New York. For this magnificent spot of land, we're talking a lot of land, were paid 21 coats, 9 fathoms of wampum, and 3 bushels of corn. What is a fathom of wampum? Seashells, 18 inches long on a string. Good question to ask kids when they come in and you don't tell them what it is and let them look it up. But this is your history. This is why we have this site so prominently displayed on our identity and so forth. Somerville is one of many communities in this area that has a proud historic past and a great future. And we hope that you will go through it. Now, there's a little bit of a scavenger hunt of symbols of the past of the city. There's a turtle, we talked about the Indian Nation. There are tools. These are symbol millstone you've seen, a lamb, a Minuteman hat, pickle jars, a carriage maker, and a park marker.
They're over there.
All these are here for you to discover. Great. Bring the kids. Have somebody come here the first Thursday in July. We'll do this until October. We're all volunteers that want to help you understand. And if you're interested in doing this type of thing, it's kind of a lot of fun, because I've learned a lot about my community, and I've learned a lot about myself and what a wonderful way to do it. Are there any questions? Thank you very much. All the best to you. Have a good day.